Welcome and thank you for joining today. The title of today's webinar is Integrating Small SSO and MFA for Seamless and Secure PeopleSoft Authentication. Our presenter today is Greg Wendt, who will introduce himself in just a moment. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. But before we go any further, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming from your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 30 minutes to an hour. And then there will be a Q&A session following the presentation. So please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for Greg to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Greg.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. So as she said, wow, slides wanted to go a little quick. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Pathlock, who we are, and then jump into the material at hand today. So a lot of you might have known us at Apsian, and we've joined and merged with Pathlock. One of the advantages of merging with Pathlock is we now have the ability to see outside of just like the PeopleSoft instances and those types of things. So Pathlock has over 100+ integrations that allows you to really employ SOD style risks and violations and understand what the users are doing inside of those applications. So you can resolve SOD from one panel across multiple different applications. You can also do provisioning and deprovisioning automated. So it's something that we can do from PeopleSoft. We can, provision or kind of the joiner, lever, mover process, if you want to talk about it from that perspective, to where you can actually, change jobs and it will change the authorizations and security inside of multiple different application sets. So all of that is delivered now in something that we can do. So it really explodes the aspect of what we're able to solve. And I think I kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit today, because when you talk about single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, a lot of those things are tied together. Typically, one needs to be done before the other one can actually happen. So if we can complete that entire life cycle for you, it just provides a better service of what we're able to do. We are a market-leading unified access orchestration platform, and you can see some of our customers that we work with and also some of our partners. With the merger, we now have over 1,300, I want to say, customers worldwide, and also over 500 employees. So we've changed as a company very significantly with this merger. Let's jump into the topic at hand. So as Stephanie said, this is probably going to be 35 to 45 minutes, somewhere in that particular range, depending upon how many questions that you guys have. And as she noted earlier, just use the GoToWebinar control panel to be able to submit any of those questions. You can really submit them at any time, and I'll probably take them as they come in. So let's jump in. So single sign-on in a nutshell. Why? What are we really after? What's the goal from an organizational perspective as to what's so important on why you want to do single sign-on? It really allows the organization to have a centralized system for identity trust. And what does this really mean? You boil it down to the perspective of, what do I gain as an employee? Why do I care whether we do single sign-on ultimately? Well, it makes it a lot easier for me to do my job. I can move in and out of different applications. I can sign in once. A lot of times people may call single sign-on one of those scenarios to where, well, I keep putting in the same user ID and password. That's not true single sign-on. That's shared passwords is what that really is. So the fact of having a centralized system for identity trust really changes that, and it really allows all of the passwords to be stored in your repository with your IDP. Typically, the IDP could be anything from Azure to Ping to Okta, something like that. Sometimes you may know, sometimes you may not know. And the nice part about it is sometimes you get extra controls and adaptive security. Could be something like MFA, could be the nice part about having very complex passwords, or how your passwords expire and how frequently you can reuse them, and those types of things. A lot of those are built into your identity provider. Why? Because that's what they do. That's the main real bullet point to take away, is you can tie in your PeopleSoft authentication into your identity provider to where it's far more robust. That's what the identity provider does for a living, not actually, HCM and financials, for example. So it allows you to tie into your entire authentication model that you're using throughout your application sets. And it allows PeopleSoft to come into that same model. And it's really a first step towards a passwordless future, which is going to be, interesting to see how it continues as time goes by. Some of the advantages, and benefits that you're going to get out of this. It really does strengthen your IT policy, because it simplifies what your administrators have to do. Thinking about, their job and the questions and challenges that they have. Let's talk about a phishing attack. So you have a user give up their credentials. Why is it important to what's happening inside of the system? Well, there's two sides to that effect. One is the user gave up their user ID and passwords. They have to have all of that reset, right? So they're going to go through and have that information, and they're going to have to get their password reset so they can be able to access all their new all the applications that they normally could do. Well, during that period of time, there's still the scenario of what did that hacker access as that user. So now you have to understand what was done, and that comes through with logging and incident response and all those other type of things. But when you really weigh the balance of that, when you're talking about the two differing opinions, resetting your password only takes, in some situations, minutes, especially when you're integrated with single sign-on. But that incident response could take weeks, honestly, on the back end. And it typically does. But the end user is not going to be affected by that, because one, they're going to be allowed to get back in the system and do their job. That's what they're going to be able to do, what they need to get paid for. So it's about that efficiency. Your users will become more efficient. That downtime gets reduced, especially when we have some sort of a attack vector like that. Your users will be able to seamlessly move between all of their application sets. And it's proven when you can move in and out of those applications, you're going to be more effective. You're also going to share information better. So you're going to work with your constituents at a better rate when you're implementing single sign-on, and have the ability to move between all of those applications without having to put in a user ID and password. Typically, a user, if they sees that, they're like, oh, I'm not going to share that. And they're going to click out and they're going to move on, rather than actually sharing whatever piece of information they were going to share. So it really does help your efficiency as an organization. You can also have instant provisioning and deprovisioning of accounts, because there's one spot to turn it on and off. It's ultimately what it boils down to. It's really, you can go into the identity provider, turn it off, and now all of a sudden people aren't going to be able to access the ERP system anymore. They're not going to be able to see PeopleSoft. They're not going to be able to get there. It's nice to have that authentication spot in one scenario. Now, when you have dev, test, stage, QA, production, all of those other instances, you still could have that one spot to say, no, we've fired that person, or they've left. We've turned them off, basically. So it really does help from a trust and cybersecurity reputation as well, because it allows you to be more efficient and effective through the rest of your controls. When we talk about PeopleSoft single sign-on and what it normally takes to do that, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. A lot of times what ends up happening is some sort of, if you've done, let's say, a homegrown solution, maybe you're doing something with the PS token, which is really proprietary PeopleSoft SSO. The PeopleSoft token allows you to, once you have that token, authenticate and access the PeopleSoft system. It also gives you the trust to move in between the PeopleSoft systems. So if you have PeopleSoft Financials, HCM, Campus Solutions, the portal, any of those types of situations, you can move in and out of all of those, because the PS token allows the node trust to continue to work through all of those. What we'll see normally is the LDAP authentication, and that's what I would call the shared password, because And that's what some organizations call, well, we have single sign-on. No, you really don't. Single sign-on is the ability to authenticate to the identity provider once and access all of the different transactions and applications that you have. When you're dealing with LDAP, immediately when you would ask for that PeopleSoft resource, you would get challenged once again for an authentication request. So that's why I kind of call it more of a shared password. When you have your modern identity providers through single sign-on, normally it could be anything from ADFS, which is Microsoft's platform. They also have Azure. So ADFS is kind of their way of doing Active Directory federated services. So it's kind of a communication protocol directly with Microsoft. Shibboleth is kind of an open source version. So some organizations stay away from that because it's open source. Others will embrace it. But really, the industry standard is a SAML 2 communication protocol, because that's what's understood from a security perspective of being able to do authentication and trust that authentication model through that SAML provider. When we retrofit PeopleSoft, and how do we work with single sign-on in PeopleSoft? Multiple different ways that you can actually do that. A couple of them are really implementing customizations that you're going to have to support and do within the PeopleSoft system. Common, it would be a reverse proxy, maybe implementing with the F5, the load balance, or something like that. The hard part about that is what it's actually doing is really injecting header values or storing the user ID and password and injecting that into the values as well. So the user just doesn't see the authentication box, but that device just injects it into the web page. Not really single sign-on, and from the security perspective, it's not authenticating to an external source. It's still utilizing that PeopleSoft authentication. So if something happens, it can really cause some havoc in your security model. You can customize it where you actually link out to the SAML open source libraries, which is one way to do it. The challenging part of some of these is depending upon what identity provider you're communicating with, some of the modifications that you're going to put in are almost hard-coded for that identity provider model. And that doesn't work out very well. I will say having as many customers as we have live on single sign-on and just interact with, identity providers have basically come down to the lowest cost provider. So it doesn't really matter which one you're using. It doesn't mean you're going to be using the same one in 2 to 3 years. There's a high probability that you're going to change which identity provider that you're working with. So, if you're putting in some sort of hard-coded scenario for working with one of those, I would definitely shy away from that, because just future-proofing your application moving forward. External authentication agents and gateways, very similar to what you see with reverse proxies on how they work and how it interacts with the application. The other option is really a native SAML interface with a plugin communicating directly to that identity provider, which is going to allow you the cleanest way to get into the system. And we'll see that in just a little bit. Multi-factor authentication, and why is this important with single sign-on? There's multiple different reasons why, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pop this up a little bit so we can kind of talk about these. Multi-factor authentication, first off, is something you know, something you have, and something you are. There's some examples of each one of those up there. Going back historically, something you know is your username and password. That's always going to be something you know. It's also not as secure as it used to be, because it's one of those things that's what the bad actors, the hackers, are targeting. They want that information. And if all your leverage is the username and password, it's going to be a challenge from your authentication model to be able to understand, is this really the user that's authenticating? Can I trust that? Especially now that all of your applications are maybe accessible over the internet. It used to be before everybody was working at their desk. Do I need to do MFA? Maybe I don't in that scenario. But, when you talk about it from an industry standard, now any system that contains PII information, private information, social security numbers, dates of birth, phone numbers, the information about your employees, for example, have to have multi-factor authentication tied to it. So it's very important from an audit and also from cyber insurance. when you have an insurance policy, typically this is what's known as due diligence. Multi-factor authentication is simply, you have to be doing this to have the policy even remain in effect. So if you're not doing MFA, your policy is not going to pay out anyway, because this is considered, basic functionality that somebody needs to implement. So besides something you also have, it's got to be something you have. And that's where you can have a push notification, an SMS, an email. There's multiple different ways that might be delivered, depending upon how your users actually are working with the system itself. Some organizations still have that physical key fob where it's the rolling 6-digit code that they're going to go ahead and put in. Kind of just depends upon what makes sense for your organization. Something you are, this is definitely an area that's evolving, and it's biometrics and, something on the device or the phone where I can put in my fingerprint and then it's going to approve all of these types of things. But that normally will come down to the interaction of what the MFA provider might be utilizing to interact with that device is really where that boils down to. So I'm going to go ahead and build out this slide as well. When we talk about how we're going to integrate multi-factor authentication into the core application itself, there's multiple different ways that we have the ability to do. Some make sense, some others don't. Depends upon how you want to interact with the end user. For example, when we integrate with single sign-on, for example, one of the favorite ways to do it is actually at login. So as that user authenticates to the identity provider, let's say Microsoft or Okta, for example, at that point, they're going to have to go through MFA to prove who they are, who they say they are. So they've got to have, multiple different ways that they can do that. That's great. It's an option. One of the things I don't like about that is how do I tie the value of MFA to that authentication request? Because normally what ends up happening is the user is going to go into the application, they're going to may or may not even access sensitive information, and then they're going to log out. So if I have to do that MFA when I'm not doing anything that's secure or really stepped up authentication, why do I need to do that multi-factor challenge? And the reason I mention that is because there's a lot of organizations and end users who have really, it's called MFA fatigue, because they get hit so frequently with MFA that they don't even think about it. And if you're not thinking about it, then it's not adding value. That's my biggest challenge with it. I'm always one of those people that if you're going to inject security into a transaction, it needs to add value ultimately. And if the end user is not tying the value of this security event to what you're implementing, then it's probably not done in an effective manner. Other ways that you can do MFA is at a trusted location. It's that goes back to the scenario, and I'll give you some examples of some organizations that I've talked with in the past. Trusted location. So it could be anything from, well, I'm at my desk, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the trusted browser. So maybe I'm not going to have to do MFA for the next 30 days because of those two combinations. Well, if I'm not going to have to do MFA for 30 days, why am I doing MFA? Because if I really boil that down to where the rubber hits the road, I may have to do MFA 12 times a year for everything that I do in my job to access the PeopleSoft system. Does that even make sense from that, type of security model? No, not really. And if I'm just escaping through all of those things, who's to say that I am who I am anymore? When you're implementing with single sign-on, you could have an end user into the system for 8 to 10 hours, 12 hours at a time, and they've really not gone through authentication in the last 10 hours. How do you know that's the same user? And I bring that up because when you're talking about insider threats and different variabilities like that, yeah, I have talked to organizations that have had somebody walk over and use another person's computer to look up information, to act as them, to even force them into logouts and make sure they have to reset their passwords because certain things were going on inside of the organization. Yeah, it happens. It happens all of the time. So when you implement some sort of MFA model that says, I'm not going to do MFA for the next 30 days. Why am I doing it? It doesn't make sense. Also, when you're talking about the transaction, the data, what you're working with, that should be variable as well. If I'm going to be accessing sensitive information, should I pass MFA? Yes, you really should. You should have to pass an MFA challenge to access that information. It's important. The end users or your employees, for example, or your students, whoever group you're looking at, should have a level of trust that their data is protected within your system. So when you're accessing sensitive information or a query or, certain functionality like that, yes, I should have to go through an MFA. Our organization should implement least privileged access to where when I am accessing the system, I'm only going to get access to the information that I need. And if I need to do something else, I go through a stepped up authentication. I go through that multi-factor and prove who I am to where I can actually do that. That's the goal of MFA. That's why it's there. Implement it at a point in time to where it makes sense, to where you can actually protect the information inside of your system. The advantage of the Pathlock system really allows us to integrate that single sign-on and multi-factor challenge multiple different ways, but very seamlessly inside of your PeopleSoft system. So the Pathlock security plugin is going to sit inside the PeopleSoft web server. That allows direct communication to the SAML identity provider. So you're not having to make customizations to your PeopleSoft system. We communicate directly to that provider, validating against that identity store, and it allows us to do either SP or IP initiated single sign-on. What that means is if they've already got a session with the identity provider, let's say Microsoft Office, for example, you've got users, they're going to sign into Office in the morning so they can get their email first thing. What do I need to do? What do I need to do from a calendar perspective? I need to see my day plan. So they're going to log in and first going to look at that, right? Well, what they've done at that particular point in time is created a session with Microsoft. That could be ADFS, it could be Azure. Both of those are the identity provider behind the scenes. So what we're saying is once that user has done that, then they could freely access the PeopleSoft system because we can check with that identity provider and say, hey, they've already authenticated. They're into the system. Let's go. Let's allow them to do their job. That's how seamless that becomes because we communicate directly back and forth. Down the line, if you decide you want to move from, Ping or Okta to Azure or whatever, replace any of those in whatever order you want to, it doesn't matter because we can still communicate to the SAML provider and still judge that. You can support multiple inside of the system because it occurs at that plugin layer. So it really allows you not to have to customize your PeopleSoft system. It really works the exact same way when we're talking about multi-factor authentication as well. So the multi-factor authentication allows you to store your policies inside of PeopleSoft, and that plugin is going to apply them. So you can have multi-factor at login. You can have multi-factor at an event, in a transaction, at a field level if you want to. You can have it at a query. If somebody needs to access query remotely, they have to pass MFA. Great idea. What if somebody's going to go in and look at the process monitor remotely? There's lots of reports there. There's lots of data that could be there. Probably a good idea to have them pass multi-factor to do that. What if you've got, somebody who's going to take care of all of your employees? They're going to do payroll or they're going to hire and fire employees. I definitely want that person to have to go through MFA to get into job data. That would be a good idea. So we can do it at that particular point in time inside of the application set to make it very streamlined and efficient. It's not going to increase, the amount of time that it takes them to do their job because it's tied in directly to the application set. So it makes it very easy. So that flow really does not inject the security where it's not efficient. But what it does allow us to do is really extend that granular contextual data security across your PeopleSoft application. So number one, it's going to strengthen your authentication. That's ultimately the goal because you can seamlessly integrate with your identity provider, whether it's single sign-on or multi-factor authentication. Sometimes that's the same, identity provider that organizations are using. Sometimes it's completely different. You also have the ability to tie in at the field. to authenticate to access certain information or transactions. So it really does strengthen that authentication model, which is important in today's risk models, because now, one, that's expected from a cyber insurance policy, but it's also something that you should be doing to protect the data of your constituents in your application. The other part about it is it really does allow us to control user access dynamically. So you can utilize different pieces of information. When they're at their desk, maybe no multi-factor. If they're on the VPN, yes, multi-factor. We can mask data. We can do all sorts of other devices as well inside of that. We can also monitor the data, that monitor the user activity as to what they're doing inside of the system as well. I often say from a security perspective, if you don't have the user activity monitoring, you don't even understand what your users are doing in the system. So how do you know how to effectively implement security controls? It all comes down to an understanding of what's happening inside of my system. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into a demo. So I'm going to flip over systems here real quick. And what I wanted to do is I want to start a couple of different ways. I'm going to start by logging into Microsoft Office first. And from a single sign-on perspective, I made the comment that we can either do IP or SP initiated. What that really means is, where does the first request come from? In this scenario, I'm going to connect to the identity provider first as Vicky's in. And you can see with my user ID and password, this has nothing to do with PeopleSoft. This is authenticating to, in this case, Microsoft ADFS. So I'm authenticating to Microsoft. No, I don't want to do that. And then what I did was I just created a SharePoint site. Really, this could be email, it could be a link, it could be a favorite, it could be anything. If I hover over the personal details, you're going to see the full URL below. That's exactly what this URL is accessing. So if I click on it, what it's going to do is it's going to open up and it's going to authenticate back to the identity provider. Was that hard on the end user? No. Was it streamlined? Was it efficient? Yes. Did it allow me to utilize deep embedded links coming out of workflow emails? Yes. All of those things can happen, which typically doesn't work when you're talking about a custom homegrown solution. So now you actually are able to pop in and out of the application really at request or at need. And when the user needs to jump in, they can jump in. They can close, they can move in and out of the system. If I look at their menu structure, they've only got the abilities to do what they need to do inside of the application. It's just like they authenticated to the PeopleSoft security model. It just happened to do that through a SAML 2 authentication model, which allows me to offsource that to the identity provider that does this for a living. So it's much easier from an organizational flow. Now, as I'm doing whatever I need to do, I can move in and out of PeopleSoft as long as that session still established or is still existing with the identity provider. So that's really what it boils down to, is I have multiple ways to do that. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new private window here real quick. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this over. So what I've got now is a private window. The reason I did a private window is it allows me not to have any sort of cookies or anything else inside of my session. So this is the difference between the IP and SP initiated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a link. That link is requesting access into the PeopleSoft system. And in this situation, what I'm doing is I'm authenticating to Okta rather than to ADFS. Two totally different identity providers within the same PeopleSoft system. So I haven't done anything to separate the difference of the two of them. I actually requested a page that I'm not authorized for, so I can go back to home. The nice part about this is I can show the difference between those two. One, when I made the request to the PeopleSoft system, it checked with Okta to see if I had an existing session. The answer in that scenario was no, it wasn't, I don't. So what happens is you have to go through the Okta authentication model. So it's user ID, password, whatever is required to pass that to access the PeopleSoft system. The users are used to that. They understand that process flow. And what it does is it brings PeopleSoft into line with the rest of that. The other side, I created that session first with ADFS, and then I accessed the PeopleSoft system. So you can see two very different ways to do it, but we're accessing the exact same PeopleSoft system. If I look at the URLs, we're HRM over here. So I just happen to do it with two different identity providers. No hard coding involved, completely able to communicate to whatever identity providers are needed at that point in time. So it allows me as an organization to not be tied into any specific vendor at that particular point. I'm going to go back home for a particular reason here, and I'm going to go into direct deposit information. The reason I want to talk about this is I'm going to transition real quick over to multi-factor authentication. The MFA I talked about earlier, we have very differing ways that we can apply that into the application set. Here, I integrated it at a field level event. So discussing how an end user, especially a self-service user, is going to utilize the PeopleSoft system, they're going to come in and out of the system. They might be in for 5-10 minutes at a time, and then they're going to be out. They're also going to do very targeted functionality at one particular moment. They're not in it all day long. So they're going to come in and look at something. It could be personal information, could be direct deposit. Well, in this scenario, I'm looking to see how much money of each check goes where. Maybe I don't need to see the account number. At that point, I really don't, because all I was really interested in was the amount over here that was going into each account. So I don't need to see the account number. But if I need to access or change that information, I can unlock that at a point in time directly inside of that transaction. So I'll do a push notification. This is set up with Duo. So I'm going to pull that open on my phone, and I'm going to approve that real quick. So as I approve it, now I have access to update that account number. From an end user, especially self-service perspective, you have completely tied the security event to the action of understanding and working with that account number. They're going to get this, they're going to understand it, they're going to tie that value together. And I say that because that's what we've heard from the customers. When implemented this way, you'll frequently get the request for additional multi-factor to protect other pages. Why? Because they get the value of, hey, I'm doing MFA for this. I'm not just doing MFA to access the app. I'm actually having to validate who I am based upon accessing certain information inside of the application. So it becomes very, very important at that level. I'm going to go back home. Another area of where we deal with multi-factor authentication, and I'm just going to pull open a transaction because you can access information that's important that you might want to inject a multi-factor challenge to pull up that transactional event. And I'm showing you this one with change my password, which I would not access inside of a SSO environment. And that did not want to process. So typically what would occur in that scenario is we would get a multi-factor challenge. I think it's actually an interface issue for us at the moment. So, but I've got that one actually configured with Okta. So it would actually pull open the Okta, and I'd have to go through the MFA there as well. So you can tie into multiple different identity providers and multiple different MFA providers all at our platform layer. So let's look at the platform layer. Since I don't have the ability to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through switch identity. And this privileged access allows me to switch into a new user. And what this does is I've got users that I have been mapped that I can switch into. In this scenario, I'm going to pick PS admin responsibilities, and I'm also going to pick the high-level PeopleSoft admin account, so the PS account. What you'll find here is I can enforce a multi-factor challenge for any authentication against that individual user. So I've got a Duo challenge for the PS user specifically because they have that PeopleSoft admin role inside of the system. So I want to enforce that they go through that challenge because it really is a holistic high-level account that has access to everything inside of the system. Now that I've done that, I can go through and I'm going to look at our AppScience security. Inside of there, let's talk about the identity. and I'm going to open up SAML ADFS identity providers. What we have here, profiles is what I like to call them. You'll see that we have two different profiles. One is ADFSB and the other one is Okta. I authenticated against both of those today already inside of this demo session. So I'll open up the ADFSB. What this does is it really creates a way for us to communicate to the identity provider. How do I communicate? What is this system going to be called? What are the URLs that I'm going to use, for example? Do I have any additional flags or information that I need to check? Am I going to generate a signature? Is it going to be passive, a force auth in? Any sort of assertion validations, checking signature, expiration, check the issuer. All of these things can all be done. And do I have a public certificate that I'm going to check? All of this is built into the PeopleSoft system, and also the user mapping, because this is an important part, because what this is doing is it's allowing you to map what attribute's going to come from ADFS or Okta to map that user into the PeopleSoft system. So with the ADFS system, I'm using username. Might be known as the name ID from SAML. So I'm just mapping that attribute into the PeopleSoft system to make sure that it maps as that user. If I do the next in list, which in PeopleSoft is just going to take me over to the Okta one, so you can see that it's the Okta auth. What I'm using over here is email. So I'm not hard coding any of that. It's a value. It's taking that attribute value. I can dig into that, and it's a construct. What am I going to do with that email operator ID, and how am I going to piece it apart, or make it effective for me to be able to work with? So all of that is stored within the PeopleSoft system. We can also provide the service provider metadata. What the metadata does is it gets imported into your identity provider to allow this PeopleSoft system to communicate with your identity provider. Ultimately, that's it. And when you're talking about resources that are needed to be able to configure it, that's the amount of time that really your identity provider admin, is going to be able to need. You give them the metadata that our team will help you make, and they can import that in, and then we can start authenticating against that system. There are a few other steps that need to take place. So we need to create, after we have that profile, we also need to make sure that we have a policy and a policy set. So inside of the policy set, I'm going to go ahead and open up that one first, because I'm going to start with what our policies look like. So this is the policy for single sign-on for ADFS. You can see it by the policy ID. This is SAML ADFS, and it's in a multi-system. The multi-system is actually telling me that I'm running both Okta and ADFS. So when I look at the conditions inside of our policy, we have conditions and actions. How that works is the conditions all need to be true before the security action below is going to fire. Really, the first two are the important one and what most organizations would have. Not logged in PeopleSoft terminology is they don't have a session. If you really want to boil that down to what that means at the finite level, is they don't have a PS token, ultimately. So since they don't have a PS token, they need to go through an authentication request, right? So the next thing we're going to look at is they are not coming from the login request page. What is the login request page? Literally just that. The PeopleSoft login page where you put in your user ID and password. That could be LDAP authenticated, or it could be PeopleSoft authenticated. Doesn't matter. But the user did not come from there. How do we know that? Because we are inside of the PeopleSoft web server, so we know. The other two items happen to be one for Okta and one for Twilio-based MFA. So when all of those are true, what's going to happen is this SAML-based ADFS authentication. So when I look at the security action is I'm going to do that. I'm doing SAML-based authentication. What provider am I going to do it with? I'm doing it with ADFSB. If I click this open, you're going to see the exact same thing that I just created with the profile. That's how it becomes tied back together. So that profile gets picked from the action, and now I'm able to utilize that. So that's how we implement that at that layer. Same type of scenario for Okta. You'll see the conditions are going to be a little bit different. One thing is that we're not looking for Twilio. So we're able to utilize that to quickly get into the system. And if I look at the authentication or the action, we're just using Okta OAuth. So tied in directly the same way. So if you ever do decide to switch identity providers down the line, All you really have to do is create a new profile, tie that into your action, and off you go. So let's talk real quickly about how you can do that from a multi-factor authentication. I'm going to go back up here to view all. And I just want to grab one of our MFAs because it's going to be very consistent to what you just saw inside of the application regarding single sign-on. So I have conditions and then I have a security action. So the conditions here, something that I'm looking for is somebody accessing a certain part of the application set. We can do that by menus, components, pages. Those are all PeopleSoft objects. So it allows me to pick and choose those very easily. So I can, know when somebody is accessing a certain part. The other thing that I like to point out is we have a logical operator to either include or exclude. So in this scenario, if I choose exclude, it would actually only allow these 5 components to be accessed without MFA. Every other component would. So that's how you can see how that would work. Logged in, once again, PS token and a servlet. Why? Because we want to make sure that it's somebody actually utilizing it. But if I open this up from a security action, the action is an MFA challenge. I have a provider and a provider ID. So let's actually go out and look at that. So I'm going to go to our MFA providers. So I can select MFA and I can select Duo. Under here, I'll have a profile just like what I did from single sign-on. That information is going to tell me how to communicate to the MFA provider. We also have the ability to set up usage restrictions. You might ask, what is that? That goes back to the varying difference between, say, single sign-on not single sign-on, but self-service access versus high privileged user. So if there's a usage restriction, maybe I want the token to expire every 2 hours. So that high privileged user has to go through that MFA every 2 hours. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I have that choice as to how I want to do it. Maybe it's the number of uses that are restricted. We had a financial company that every 3 accesses into query, they had to do an MFA. That was their choice. But all of that's set up and able to be able to configure at that profile layer to where you don't have to go in and try to modify or hard code your system to be able to do it. So that's how we're able to integrate those. Same type of scenario, if I look at how this is done from the action or the policy, I'm selecting the different action for Duo or Okta or whoever my MFA provider is at that particular point. So I build out the security policy defining where I want that MFA, and then I pick my provider. So now you can understand how we're not having to customize that PeopleSoft system to do it. So I'm going to flip back over to the PowerPoint here real quick. And really, when you talk about the tips for a successful SAML, SSO, and MFA project and implementation, you've got to have that seamless interaction with PeopleSoft because that's ultimately the most important part. That's what you're trying to do is protect it, but you also want to integrate it to where it can act just like every one of your other applications inside of your enterprise to where you can interact with that seamlessly through SSO. But you can also interject that MFA wherever it's needed because often not that's a requirement as well. Could be an audit requirement, could be a requirement coming from your SISO, your Chief Information Security Officer, for example. So, implementing these types of things can often not cause heartburn from the perspective of implementing customizations inside of your system, whether it's for SAML or whether it's for MFA. You don't want to have to do that. It makes sense to be able to plug and play what provider you're going to be able to do it because it gives you that flexibility to select whatever provider you want to work with because you're not hard coded. Another thing is really ensure that your solution supports deep links. That's a real big challenge for a lot of homegrown solutions when you talk buy versus build. It's difficult to get that to work. We've got all of that completely baked into the solution. And when you're talking about what is your ongoing costs, how much is this going to take me to maintain? Our integration ties in at a layer to where it's not something that you have to look at from the PUM updates for the most part. We integrate more at the people tools layer. So regardless of whether you're running financials or HCM, campus solutions, or the portal, as I like to call it, even though it's not called that anymore. Shows my age, I guess, from that perspective. So it really reduces your the lifecycle management of what you're having to do and lowers those total cost of ownerships. but reduces your risks as an organization because it ties in your PeopleSoft system to your SSO model and also to your multi-factor authentication model. Talking about the implementation timeline and how long this really takes. I've done numerous different implementations on both. Multi-factor authentication was probably the one that I did the most. I've got numerous installs and configurations that went live in less than 30 days. It all depends upon what the organization wants to do, but this can be done very quickly. From an SSO perspective, yes, I have seen implementations done in less than 7 days because of how it plugs into the system and how it's configuration, not customization, and you're not having to deal with additional hardware. That's the thing about proxies or gateways or flow throughs, is you're always having to implement additional hardware inside of that, so there's additional cost to maintain that as well. This allows you to communicate directly from the existing PeopleSoft web server to your identity provider or to your multi-factor authentication provider. And you also have support 24/7. And our updates are synchronized with the PeopleSoft system. So really allows you a turnkey solution to implement this very quickly inside of your PeopleSoft system, so you can have that whole support model inside of PeopleSoft to allow you the ability to really project what you want inside of your system from a security perspective. So with that, I'm going to open up to any questions while we have that going on here real quick. So I'm going to open up that real quick. And by the way, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and the little questions module to be able to ask any questions. So one of the first questions that came in was just to make sure, when you talk about SaaS, so that is software as a service. We do have several customers that are implemented in both a, kind of a SaaS and a more of cloud type environment where they're actually just leveraging the hardware, and then we also have people inside of OCI and just about every hosted environment out there. The ability to be able to do this really boils down to inside of a SaaS environment as to what type of contract you have with your SaaS provider. We do have some, I want to say, that are implemented with SaaS that are actually doing this from a security perspective. We are a certified solution from Oracle, and that typically will get you past that barrier of implementing with a SaaS provider, if that makes sense. So that is one question that came in. So if there's any other questions, you can go ahead and submit those with the question button there. Close that out. And I actually need to open up here real quick. So I am going to stop sharing because I grabbed the wrong slide here real quick from a session earlier. And I need to grab our new final slide. So pasted in the wrong one. That happens from time to time. So let's pop this one open and we will do that. So with that, I'll hand back to Stephanie to wrap up today's session with any additional announcements.
Thank you, Greg. Just a few announcements. We have our next webinar for PeopleSoft will be automating PeopleSoft SOD quickly detect and mitigate compliance risks in FSCM. And that will be Tuesday, November 15th and at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And then we have our Pathlock Innovation Series coming up. That will be a series of webinars over the course of December 5th through 8th. We're going to have a day for SAP, a day for PeopleSoft, a day for Oracle, and all of our solutions. And we'll have a bunch of partners joining us, presenting on their solutions as well. So if you'd like to join that, you can find information about that on our website, or you can join our email list for announcements, or you can find that on LinkedIn, on the Pathlock LinkedIn page. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much, and thank you, Greg, for presenting, and we hope to see you next time.